The obsidian walls of the high synod of the Ethelgard Presidium seemed to drink the light from the dual suns beyond the transparency fields, casting long, oppressive shadows over the assembly. The air within the vast, cavernous chamber was recycled, stale with the scent of ozone and the pheromones of 1,000 different species, all of them thick with the acrid tang of terror. This was not a place of celebration. It was a mausoleum for living hopes, a theater where the demise of civilizations was debated with cold, bureaucratic detachment. In the center of the amphitheater, hovering within a gravity well projector, a three-dimensional rendering of the Authari system spun in a slow, agonizing rotation. It was a simulation of death. Crimson fractals bloomed across the surface of the Authari prime world, representing the orbital bombardment raining down from the jagged, biomechanical armada of the Kravek hegemony. The Kravek were not merely conquering, they were erasing. They were a swarm of locusts made of star metal and hatred, consuming history and biology alike, leaving only silence in their wake. And the High Synod, the governing body of the known galaxy, the shield of the civilized stars, did nothing but watch. High Counselor Vrix, the eldest representative of the Authari, stood upon his podium, his avian grasping talons trembling against the polished railing. His feathers, usually a vibrant iridescent blue indicative of high status and scholarly achievement, were dull and molting from stress. He looked out at the sea of faces, chitinous, scaled, furred, and energy-wreathed, and saw only evasion. The Presidium was paralyzed. The Kravek hegemony was considered an unstoppable force of nature, a galactic hurricane that could not be fought, only weathered. But the Authari were not weathering it, they were drowning. Vrix adjusted his translator collar, the device humming against his throat, and spoke, his voice cracking with the weight of his dying people. He pleaded not for salvation, for he knew that was a fantasy, but for a witness. He asked that the archives be saved, that the refugees trapped in the gravity wells be granted asylum, that the galaxy acknowledge the tragedy unfolding in the spiral arm's edge. His words hung in the vast silence of the chamber, swallowed by the apathy of fear. The response from the Presidium's chancellor, a towering, multi-limbed crystalline entity from the core worlds, was a symphony of harmonic resonance that translated into a polite, diplomatic refusal. Intervention, the chancellor argued, would provoke the Kravek into a wider war. The logic of the many outweighed the survival of the few. The Authari were to be a sacrifice to the god of stability. It was in this moment of absolute despair that the topic of the distress signal arose. A minor functionary, a nervous amphibious creature reviewing the subspace telemetry, signaled for attention. The data stream indicated that the Authari planetary defense network in its final throes had bypassed the standard Presidium frequencies and utilized an ancient, forbidden bandwidth, a wide-spectrum, high-amplitude broadcast sent into the unknown void towards the galactic rim. The uncivilized sectors, the Deathworlds, a ripple of unease moved through the assembly. To broadcast into the uncontrolled zones was to invite madness. The galaxy was structured, ordered, and safe within the Presidium's borders. Beyond lay chaos, high-gravity hellscapes, and species that had failed the Great Filter. The functionary projected the trajectory of the signal. It had not just gone into the void, it had been intercepted. It had struck a system that the Presidium had quarantined 3 cycles ago, a system designated Sol. The murmurs grew louder, shifting from apathy to derision and concern. The humans, the Terrans, the species that had evolved on a world with crushing gravity, volatile tectonic activity, and a predatory ecosystem that should have wiped them out a dozen times over. They were considered a biological curiosity, a species too stubborn to die but too volatile to integrate. They were primitives who had barely mastered faster-than-light travel, possessing ships that were ugly, blocky things powered by controlled explosions rather than elegant zero-point energy. Lord Thalker, the militant representative of the Draconis Combine, let out a chuff of amused scorn, smoke curling from his nostrils. He stood, his armored bulk imposing, and dismissed the notion of Terran involvement. He argued that even if the soft-skinned primates received the message, they could do nothing. Their fleet, if one could call it that, was a collection of retrofitted hauling vessels and kinetic destroyers. They used projectile weaponry, slugs of metal thrown at high speeds, barbaric tools for a barbaric species. Against the energy shields and plasma lances of the Kravek, the humans would be nothing more than debris. Thalker mocked the very idea of a Deathworlder response. He painted a picture of the humans cowering in their gravity well, terrified of the galactic stage, likely assuming the signal was a threat rather than a plea. The assembly found comfort in his arrogance. It was easier to mock the primitives than to face their own cowardice. They analyzed the physics of the Terran response time, calculating that even if the humans launched their ships immediately, their crude warp drives would take weeks to traverse the distance. By then, Athari Prime would be a ball of glass. The logic was sound. The math was irrefutable. The humans were a non-factor. But the universe has a way of defying the calculus of the complacent. As the debate raged on, turning into a circular firing squad of blame and justification, the sensor grid of the Presidium began to chime. Not the soft, rhythmic ping of merchant traffic, but a discordant, harsh warning klaxon that indicated a massive displacement of space-time. The holograph in the center of the room flickered, the simulation of the dying Athari world momentarily obscured by a wash of static. The technicians scrambled, their fingers dancing over haptic interfaces, confused by the readings. It was not a hyperspace breach. Hyperspace was a fluid medium, a tunnel through the sublayer of reality. This was different. This was a tier. Something was not sliding through space. Something was grabbing the fabric of the cosmos and pulling itself through by sheer brute force. The readings spiked off the charts, gravitational waves so intense they rattled the station's hull. The coordinates were not in the distant periphery. They were local, immediate, directly above the burning atmosphere of Athari Prime. The view screen shifted, zooming in on the real-time feed from the system. The Galactic Fleet, a swarm of thousands of needle ships, paused in their bombardment. They sensed it too. A distortion, a shadow falling over the sun. Space did not shimmer, it cracked. A fissure of absolute darkness opened in the high orbit of Athari Prime, bleeding hawking radiation and exotic particles, and from that wound in the universe they emerged. They did not glide out with the grace of the Presidium cruisers. They slammed into reality with the weight of mountains. The Terran fleet. It was impossible. The scale of the vessels defied the intelligence reports. These were not the retrofitted haulers the Draconis had mocked. These were Leviathans. Great slab-sided monstrosities of gray hull plating, scarred by micrometeors and cosmic dust. They lacked the elegant curves of galactic aesthetics. They were utilitarian, brutal, and imposing. Blocks of durasteel and tungsten, bristling with antenna arrays and weapon ports that seemed too large, too primitive, and yet terrifyingly functional. There were no energy auras, no shimmering shields, just armor. Meters upon meters of ablative armor designed to take a beating and keep going. The lead ship, a behemoth that eclipsed the Kravak command carrier, bore a name painted in stark white letters across its prow, translatable only as the Indomitable Spirit. Silence descended upon the High Synod. The arrogance of Lord Thalker evaporated, replaced by a stunned confusion. How had they arrived so quickly? How had they bypassed the hyperspace lanes? The physics baffled the finest minds in the room. The humans had not traveled through the lanes. They had calculated a trajectory through the dead space. The turbulent, chaotic zones between stars where navigation was thought impossible due to gravitational shear. They had brute-forced the math. They had risked total annihilation to cut the travel time from weeks to hours. It was a maneuver of suicidal insanity, the kind of risk only a species evolved on a death world would consider viable. The Kravak fleet, controlled by a hive-mind intelligence that prioritized efficiency and threat assessment, hesitated. They scanned the new arrivals, their sensors probing for energy signatures. They found fusion reactors, archaic, volatile fusion fire, burning deep within the bellies of the human ships. They found kinetic railguns loaded with ferric tungsten slugs. They found nuclear warheads. The Kravak logic processors categorized the threat: high lethality, low technology. A paradox. The Kravak swarm reoriented, thousands of ships turning away from the burning planet to face the gray wall of human steel. The communication channels of the Presidium remained silent. The humans had not hailed the council. They had not asked for permission to enter the zone. They had not issued a declaration of war. They simply placed themselves between the predator and the prey. High Counselor Vrix watched the screen, his heart's pounding in his chest. He saw the Kravak charge. It was a terrifying sight, a wave of plasma and coherent light rushing toward the Terran line. The Presidium representatives winced, expecting the primitive human ships to vaporize under the onslaught of superior technology. The energy beams struck the Indomitable Spirit. The hull glowed cherry-red molten metal sloughing off into the void. Debris scattered, but the ship did not buckle. It did not explode. The sheer mass of the armor, layers upon layers of composite density, absorbed the heat. The ship shuddered, vented glowing gas into space to disperse the thermal load, and held its line. It was impossible. No shield could take that punishment, shields overloaded. But armor simply sacrificed itself inch by inch. The humans were trading their own skin for time. Then the response came. It was not a beam of light. It was physics. The entire flank of the Terran fleet lit up with the muzzle flashes of magnetic acceleration. Thousands of railguns fired in unison. There was no sound in the vacuum, but the visual was a testament to violence. The projectiles, unguided, dumb masses of metal, crossed the gap in a fraction of a second. The Kravak shields, designed to disperse energy weapons, frequencies, and heat, were ill-equipped to deal with millions of tons of kinetic energy delivered at a percentage of the speed of light. The slugs smashed through the delicate energy barriers like stones through a spiderweb. They punched through the biomechanical hulls of the Kravak ships, shattering spines, rupturing containment vessels, and turning the advanced alien destroyers into expanding clouds of shrapnel. It was brutal, ugly, and devastatingly effective. The Kravak formation shattered. The hive mind reeled, unable to process an enemy that did not dance, did not fence, but simply walked into the fire and punched back with the force of a tectonic plate. Inside the High Synod, the atmosphere shifted from shock to a primal, instinctive fear. This was not war as they knew it. This was not the civilized exchange of energies. This was a brawl. The humans fought with a cold, calculated ferocity that unsettled the ancient races. They watched as the Terran ships launched fighters, tiny, nimble craft that wove through the flak with reckless abandon. These pilots were not drones, they were biologicals. The sensor telemetry picked up their biosigns. Their heart rates were elevated, their adrenaline spiking, but their movements were precise. They were afraid, yet they flew straight into the mouth of death. This psychological profile confused the onlookers. The Presidium species fought for logic, for territory, or because they were programmed to. The humans appeared to be fighting out of pure, unadulterated stubbornness. As the battle raged, a signal finally broke through the static of the Presidium's main receiver. It was an audio-only transmission, heavily encrypted, originating from the indomitable spirit. The technicians scrambled to isolate it, projecting the sound into the center of the silent amphitheater. There was no visual of a conquering warlord, no grand posturing, just a voice. It was a male voice, calm, weary, with the background hum of damage control sirens and the distant thrum of recycling loaders. "This is Admiral Vance of the United Terran Coalition," the voice said. The translation software struggled to convey the tone. It was devoid of the aggression the aliens expected. It was professional, almost clinical, yet underscored with a profound, simmering gravity. "We received a distress call on the emergency band. We are responding to a code black situation, genocide in progress. To the aggressor fleet, you are currently in violation of the sentient rights protocols we hold to be universal. Stand down and withdraw, or we will continue to dismantle you. To the Athari people, hold on. We are here. We aren't leaving." The simplicity of the statement struck Vrix like a physical blow. We aren't leaving. In all the millennia of Presidium politics, no one had ever said that to a species on the brink of extinction without attaching a treaty, a debt, or a condition. The humans were bleeding in the void, their ships taking massive damage, their crews dying in the vacuum, and they were doing it for strangers. Why? The question hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Why would a Deathworlder species, isolated and paranoid, risk its existence for the Athari? The battle turned. The Kravak, realizing their energy weapons were failing to stop the kinetic avalanche, attempted to close the distance, to board the human ships and slaughter the crews in close quarters. This, the Presidium analysts realized with horror, was a mistake. The viewscreen showed Kravak boarding pods latching onto the hull of a Terran cruiser. The internal sensors of the Terran ship, which had been hacked by the Presidium's curiosity, broadcast the internal struggle. Aliens expected soft, panicked crewmen. Instead, they found the Terran Marines. Clad in exoskeletal void armor, wielding rotary projectile cannons and vibrating monolithic blades, the humans met the boarders in the corridors. The gravity on the human ship was set to Terran standard, twice that of the galactic average. The Kravak boarders were sluggish, crushed by the weight of the air itself, their movements labored. The humans moved with terrifying speed in their natural environment. It was a slog. The primitive biology of the humans, dense bones, redundant circulatory pathways, high adrenaline response systems, made them biological tanks. The Kravak were purged from the ships, their biomatter painting the bulkheads. Realizing the engagement was mathematically unwinnable, the Kravak hive mind executed a retreat. It was not a rout, it was a calculation. The cost of biomass expenditure exceeded the value of the Athari system. The swarm turned, engines flaring, and vanished into hyperspace, leaving behind a field of debris and the broken, burning remnants of their vanguard. The Athari system was saved. The bombardment had ceased. The silence that followed was louder than the guns. The human fleet did not pursue. They did not cheer. They maintained formation, their damaged ships venting atmosphere, their sensors sweeping the dark for a counterattack. They formed a protective shell around the planet, a wall of gray metal between the Athari and the dark. Days later, a shuttle departed from the indomitable Spirit and descended to the surface of Athari Prime. The landing zone was a ruin of shattered crystal spires and burning libraries. High Counselor Vrix, having transited from the Presidium station to his homeworld, stood amidst the rubble of his ancestral home. The air was thick with smoke, but the bombardment had stopped before the capital was leveled. He waited, flanked by his surviving guards, their energy pikes lowering as the Terran craft touched down. It was a blocky, ugly thing, blasting the ground with hot jets of chemical flame. The ramp lowered, and the humans emerged. They were not the giants of legend, nor the monsters of the Draconis' nightmares. They were bipedal of average height, encased in environmental suits that hissed softly as they adjusted to the lower atmospheric pressure. They removed their helmets. Vrix looked into the face of Admiral Vance. The human was older, his face lined with stress, his eyes dark and tired. He had a scar running down his jawline, and his hair was cropped short and gray. He did not look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had seen too much. "High Counselor," Vance said, his voice rough but respectful. He did not bow. He offered a hand, a gesture Vrix recognized from the diplomatic files as a sign of open trust. Vrix hesitated, then extended his talon, grasping the human's gloved hand. The grip was firm, surprisingly strong. "Admiral," Vrix managed, his voice trembling. You came, the Presidium debated, the great powers watched. But you came, why? We have nothing to offer you. Our trade routes are ruined. Our libraries are burning. We are a broken people." Vance looked around at the devastation, at the weeping Athari pulling survivors from the rubble, at the smoke curling up into the twilight sky. He looked back at Vrix, and his expression softened, a deep, melancholic empathy surfacing in his eyes. "We didn't come for trade, Counselor, and we didn't come for glory." He paused, looking up at the sky where his battered fleet held the line. "You call our home a death world, and you're right. It tried to kill us every day of our evolution. Ice ages, volcanoes, plagues, predators. We spent our entire history fighting the planet, fighting the beasts, fighting each other." Vance took a breath, the air of the alien world tasting strange to him. "We almost destroyed ourselves. We learned the hard way what happens when you turn your back on suffering. We made a promise when we finally united that if we ever heard a cry for help in the dark, we wouldn't just listen, we would answer. Because for a long time we screamed into the void and no one answered us. We decided to be the ones who answer." The philosophy struck Vrix with the force of a revelation. The other species of the galaxy sought perfection, stability, harmony. They avoided conflict to preserve their utopia. The humans had been forged in conflict. They did not fear the fire because they had been born in it. Their ethics were not derived from abstract logic, but from the visceral memory of pain. They were kind because they knew exactly what cruelty felt like. They were the galaxy's immune system, dormant until the infection appeared, willing to burn themselves out to save the body. The scene shifted back to the High Synod. The mood had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a wary respect and a deep, unsettling introspection. The Terran coalition had not asked for a seat on the council. They had not demanded payment. They simply requested coordinates for the nearest medical outposts to offload their wounded and the Athari refugees they had scooped up from the orbital habitats. The Presidium granted the request immediately. The human fleet began to limp away, heading back toward the Sol sector, back to their quarantine zone. But they left something behind. A data package. The council gathered to review it. It was decrypted by the finest minds of the Ethelguard. It was not a boast. It was an analysis. The humans, during the battle, had not just been firing blindly. Their sensors, crude but tuned for different spectrums than the Presidium's, had penetrated the Kravak command network. They had stolen the Kravak's navigational logs. The room fell silent as the implications of the data were revealed. The Kravak hegemony, the scourge of the sector, the unstoppable swarm. They hadn't been invading. They had been fleeing. The star charts retrieved from the Kravak flagship showed their trajectory over the last 100 cycles. They were moving away from the galactic edge, pushing inward, displacing other species in a desperate bid for territory in the core. They were running from something. The human data included a sensor echo, a ghost signal picked up from the deep void beyond the galactic rim, the direction from which the Kravak had fled. It was a sound, a rhythmic, synthetic pulse, not random cosmic noise. It was a carrier wave, and it was massive. The scale of the signal suggested a structure or a fleet of planetary proportions. It was moving toward the galaxy. It was consuming stars. The spectral analysis showed stars blinking out, their light simply vanishing, blocked by a Dyson swarm of incomprehensible size. This was the great filter the philosophers whispered about. The Kravek, for all their horror, were merely the rats running from the sinking ship. The final file in the human data package was a video message from Admiral Vance, recorded after the battle, in the privacy of his quarters. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes locking with the eyes of every counselor in the room. "We saw what they were running from," Vance said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The Kravek were scared, and if something can scare a biomechanical swarm into a panic, it's a threat to all of us. We analyzed the signal. It's coming. It will be here in less than a century." Vance leaned forward. "You called us Deathworlders. You thought it was an insult. You thought it meant we were savages. But you're going to need savages. You're going to need a species that knows how to dig in, how to bleed, and how to fight a war that can't be won with logic." "The SOS you heard. It didn't just wake us up, it woke it up. But we are awake now, too. The Terran Coalition is declaring a galactic concordat of defense. We are fortifying the rim. We are building a wall, and we are inviting you, all of you, to stand behind it. If you want to survive what's coming, you better stop debating and start building. Earth out." The transmission cut to black. The Presidium sat in silence. The petty politics, the trade disputes, the border squabbles, all of it seemed suddenly microscopic. The true nature of the universe had been revealed. It was a dark, hostile forest, and the wolves were coming. But for the first time, the galaxy realized they had a wolf of their own. High Counselor Vrix looked at the blank screen, then at the simulation of his saved world. He realized then that the arrival of the humans was not just a rescue mission. It was the beginning of a new age, the age of the Deathworlders. The humans had not joined the galactic community as equals. They had joined as its guardians. They were the monsters who would fight the monsters. And as Vrix looked around the chamber, he saw the fear in the eyes of the other diplomats, but he also saw something else. Hope. For the first time in history, the Ethelgard Presidium did not adjourn. They did not retreat to their chambers. They began to work. The Draconis representative, Thalker, was the first to speak. He did not mock. He did not posture. He simply activated his tactical display and opened a channel to the Terran fleet before it jumped out of range. "This is Lord Thalker," the dragon-like alien rumbled, his voice echoing in the hall. "We have received your data. The Draconis Combine offers its shipyards to the Terran Initiative. We wish to see the schematics of your railguns. We have much to discuss." The dialogue that followed was technical, urgent, and unified. The shock of the Terran intervention had shattered the stagnation of the Empire. The realization that they had underestimated the humans was eclipsed by the realization that they had overestimated their own safety. The galaxy was not a garden. It was a fortress under siege, and the walls had been crumbling for eons without anyone noticing. Deep in the void, aboard the indomitable Spirit, Admiral Vance watched the stars streak by as the fleet entered the slipstream. He held a tablet in his hand, displaying the incoming transmission from the Presidium. A faint smile touched his lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of relief. They weren't alone anymore. The burden of the death world was no longer theirs to carry in isolation. He walked to the bridge window, looking out at the swirling nebula of the slipstream. He thought of Earth, of the blue marble that had birthed such a violent, beautiful, contradictory species. He thought of the graveyards on Mars, the memorials on Titan, the price they had paid to survive their own infancy. They had survived so they could be this. The shield, the anvil. "Admiral," the comms officer called out, a young woman from the Martian colonies. "The Presidium is asking for our strategic assessment of the Rim threat. They want to know our orders." Vance turned back to the crew, the bridge bathed in the red glow of emergency lighting. "Tell them," he said, his voice steady, "that we don't give orders, we give warnings. Tell them to wake up their industries. Tell them to sharpen their claws, and tell them—" He paused, his gaze hardening. "Tell them the Deathworlders are holding the line, but we're going to need a lot more ammo." The story of the galaxy had changed in a single rotation. The SOS from the Authari had been a cry in the dark, but the response from Earth had been a lighting of a torch. The aliens were stunned, yes. They were terrified, but they were also alive. And as the Terran fleet vanished into the dark, heading toward the unknown threat looming on the horizon, the galaxy understood the true meaning of the human anomaly. They were not a mistake of evolution. They were its contingency plan. The calm, ethical, terrifyingly powerful children of Saul had arrived, and the war for the future had just begun. The narrative of the universe is often written in the ink of tragedy, but occasionally it is punctuated by moments of defiance that alter the trajectory of fate itself. This was one such moment. The Athari system, now a symbol of resilience, began to rebuild not with crystal and light, but with reinforced ferrocrete and kinetic batteries, guided by human engineers who walked the ruins with sadness in their eyes and blueprints in their hands. They taught the Athari not how to write poetry, but how to survive the winter. And the Athari, the scholars of the galaxy, learned that sometimes the pen is not mightier than the sword. Sometimes the pen must be melted down to forge the sword. In the shadows of the High Synod, the political maneuvering ceased. The factions that had spent centuries bickering over resource rights now pooled their assets. The threat of the Great Filter forced a unity that diplomacy never could. The humans became the catalyst. They were the strange, terrifying glue holding the new alliance together. They were viewed with a mix of awe and horror. The aliens watched the humans eat, saw them laugh, saw them mourn, and could not reconcile these soft behaviors with the cold, mechanical brutality they displayed in combat. It was a duality that fascinated the galaxy. The humans were capable of profound gentleness, rebuilding orphanages, treating the wounded with tender care. And yet when the alarm rang, they flipped a switch and became engines of destruction. This psychological depth, this ability to compartmentalize violence, was what truly stunned the aliens. The Kravik had no empathy, they were machines. The Presidium species had too much empathy, they were paralyzed by it. The humans had mastered the balance. They felt everything, yet did what was necessary. It was a burden that aged them, a tragedy written in their genetic code. They were the sad warriors, the reluctant demons. As the cycles passed, the Terran wall along the galactic rim began to take shape. It was a monumental undertaking, a megastructure of sensors, minefields, and fortress worlds. The Presidium poured its wealth into the project, while the humans provided the strategy. The alien fleets, once sleek and fragile, began to adopt Terran design philosophies. Armor replaced shields. Redundancy replaced elegance. The aesthetic of the galaxy shifted from the beautiful to the brutalist. It was an ugly change, but a necessary one. The final scene of this chapter in galactic history took place not in a war room, but in a quiet garden on the restored Athari Prime. High Counselor Vrix sat with Admiral Vance, who had returned for a brief inspection of the defenses. The two old beings, one avian and one primate, watched the sun set over the recovering city. "You changed us," Vrix said softly. "We were dreaming, Admiral. We were dreaming of a universe that didn't exist. You woke us up." Vance nodded slowly, sipping a cup of synthetic coffee. "Dreams are nice," he said. "We dream too. We dream of a day when we don't have to be this, when we can put down the armor and just be, but until then someone has to stay awake." "The threat beyond the rim?" Vrix asked, looking up at the first stars appearing in the twilight. "Do you think we can beat it?" Vance followed his gaze. He looked at the vastness of the cosmos, the cold, indifferent dark that held horrors beyond imagination. He thought of the signal, the silence, the sheer scale of the enemy approaching. "I don't know," Vance admitted, his voice honest. "I really don't know, but I know this: we're going to make them choke on every inch they try to take. We're going to make them regret coming here, and we're going to do it together." Vrix trilled a soft, mournful, yet resolute sound. "Together," a strange word for a Deathworlder. "The best word," Vance replied. The camera of history pulls back then, rising above the garden, above the city, above the atmosphere. It drifts past the orbital shipyards where Athari and human workers weld plates of star metal side by side. It moves past the fleet, a mixed armada of a dozen species, standing vigil in the dark. It moves out to the edge of the galaxy, looking into the void. There in the deep black, a faint, rhythmic pulsing can be seen on the sensors, the heartbeat of the encroaching storm. But standing against it is a new light, a defiant, jagged, stubborn light, the light of Earth and the galaxy it rallied. The SOS had been answered, and the silence would never be unchallenged again. The aliens were stunned not by the violence but by the virtue. And in that stunning they found their own strength. The Deathworlders had not just saved them, they had taught them how to live.